In the tranquil and often sheltered world of Glenwood University, nestled deep in the heart of a small town, the winds of change were always stirring. On the outside, Glenwood appeared to be an institution built on tradition and academic excellence, offering a haven for young minds eager to change the world. However, behind the ivy-covered walls, there were secrets that no one was prepared for. In March 2011, the sleepy town of Glenwood was shaken to its core. Professor Thomas Baldwin, a revered member of the psychology department, was found dead in his office. His lifeless body lay sprawled across the floor, a chilling scene of violence that no one could comprehend. The news spread quickly through the university, sending shockwaves not only through the academic community, but also through the town that had once felt so safe. The details surrounding Baldwin's death were disturbing and clouded in mystery. The initial investigation suggested nothing more than a tragic accident, but it wasn't long before darker truths began to surface. Baldwin had been involved in a secret affair with one of his students, a transgender woman named Emanuela Evans. What seemed like an isolated incident soon revealed itself as something far more sinister. This was no ordinary scandal. It was a case of manipulation, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. Emanuela Evans, known as Emmanuel before her transition, had spent most of her life searching for a sense of belonging. Born in 1989 in a small, conservative town in Mississippi, Emmanuel always felt like an outsider. Even at a young age, she knew that something about her identity didn't align with the world around her. She was raised in a deeply religious family, where traditional gender roles were strongly enforced. There was no room for questions or deviation. By the time Emmanuel reached high school, the pressure to conform to societal expectations became unbearable. Despite excelling academically, she felt increasingly isolated and disconnected from the life she was expected to lead. Her family, unwavering in their religious convictions, couldn't understand the inner turmoil that was consuming her, but the discovery of her true self would soon take her far away from everything she had ever known. In 2007, Emmanuel made the life-changing decision to apply to Glenwood University. She saw it as her escape from the oppressive environment of her hometown. Glenwood, known for its liberal culture and progressive policies, seemed like the perfect place to start anew. It was here that Emmanuel would begin the long process of transitioning into Emanuela. The transition was far from easy. Emanuela's family cut ties with her when she came out as transgender, and the emotional toll was immense. Her father never responded to her heartfelt letters, while her mother's lone phone call was filled with harsh words and judgment. Alone and vulnerable, Emanuela navigated this painful period without the support she so desperately needed. At Glenwood, Emanuela found a place where she could at least begin to express her true identity. The campus, though still rife with whispers and stares, offered more acceptance than she had ever known before. While some professors and students supported her, the weight of her isolation was still very real. Even though she was physically free, emotionally, she felt like a prisoner to her own identity. It was during this difficult time that Emanuela crossed paths with Professor Thomas Baldwin. Baldwin was a man known for his intellectual brilliance. A respected psychologist with numerous publications under his belt, he was adored by his students for his deep understanding of the human mind. His calm demeanor and empathetic nature made him seem like the perfect mentor, especially for a student like Emanuela, who was struggling to come to terms with her own identity. At first, the relationship between Baldwin and Emanuela was professional. He served as her academic advisor, offering guidance and insight into her studies in psychology. However, as time passed, Baldwin began to take a more personal interest in Emanuela's emotional struggles. It wasn't long before their mentorship turned into something more. He was patient with her, listened to her anxieties, and spoke to her in a way no one else did. She began to feel like she was truly seen. In the fall of 2010, Baldwin started to make Emanuela feel validated in ways that no one else had. He complimented her bravery in transitioning and assured her that she was finally becoming the person she was always meant to be. These words of affirmation were exactly what Emanuela had been yearning for. She began to crave his attention, believing that Baldwin was the one person who truly understood her. But as their relationship deepened, the lines between mentorship and something darker blurred. Baldwin, in his late 40s, began to use his position of power to manipulate Emanuela. The relationship was kept a secret, and Baldwin constantly reminded her that the world was not ready for their love, particularly because she was transgender. His words, though comforting at first, soon became a tool for control. By January 2011, Baldwin and Emanuela's relationship had escalated into a full-blown affair. Baldwin, ever the manipulator, assured her that their love must remain hidden. If anyone found out, both their reputations would be ruined. Emanuela, already fragile from years of rejection, clung to Baldwin's words, convinced that this was the only form of acceptance she would ever find. But as the weeks went by, the affair began to feel suffocating. Baldwin's promises of love were laced with threats, subtle hints that if she didn't comply with his wishes, there would be consequences. He promised that things would get better, but only if she remained in the shadows, hidden from the world. Emanuela, starved for affection and validation, found herself trapped. She believed that Baldwin was the one who could fill the void left by her family's rejection. She gave him everything, yet with every passing day, the relationship became more toxic. Baldwin was no longer the supportive figure he had once been. He had become a controlling, manipulative force in her life. By March 6, 2011, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Baldwin had become distant, emotionally withdrawn, and his earlier affection had faded into indifference. Emanuela, heartbroken and confused, could no longer ignore the cracks in their relationship. When she left Baldwin's office that night, she had no idea that this would be the last time she would see him alive. On March 8, 2011, Professor Baldwin's body was discovered in his office. The news sent shockwaves through the university and the small town. At first, no one knew who could be responsible for such a crime, but as the investigation unfolded, all signs pointed toward Emanuela. She was the last person known to have been with Baldwin before his death. When detectives questioned Emanuela, she admitted to being in Baldwin's office the day before the murder. She claimed she had been there for tutoring, but she omitted the most important detail: their affair. Emanuela was well aware that once the truth came to light, everything would change. The university, the town, and the entire community would turn against her. As the investigation dug deeper into Emanuela's past, the truth about her identity emerged. They learned of her painful journey of self-discovery, her transition into Emanuela, and the abandonment she faced from her family. They also uncovered how Baldwin had preyed upon her vulnerability, manipulating her in ways that were both emotional and psychological. Despite her mounting anxiety, Emanuela maintained her innocence. She insisted she had not murdered Baldwin, but the affair, her emotional turmoil, and her connection to the victim were undeniable. As the police began to piece together the puzzle, a shocking truth began to emerge. The affair between Baldwin and Emanuela had never been just about love. It was about control, manipulation, and exploitation. As the investigation into Professor Baldwin's death continued, it became clear that the town of Glenwood was not going to rest until the truth came out. The police worked tirelessly to examine every lead, every witness, and every piece of evidence. The story of Baldwin and Emanuela became a focal point for everyone in the community, but the complexity of their relationship made it difficult to draw any definitive conclusions. The police began to interrogate Emanuela more intensely. At first, she maintained her innocence, but the pressure was building. The authorities uncovered that Baldwin had been keeping detailed records of his sessions with students, including his time with Emanuela. Among the notes, detectives found strange entries, notes about their personal meetings, their relationship dynamics, and even about Emanuela's transition. There were mentions of a growing tension in their relationship, but nothing that directly indicated murder. Still, the more the investigators dug, the more they realized how powerful Baldwin's influence over Emanuela had been. It was impossible to ignore the emotional manipulation he had exerted over her, exploiting her vulnerabilities and keeping her tied to him in a web of secrecy and control. One of the most troubling pieces of evidence was a handwritten note found in Baldwin's office. It was a message from Emanuela, dated just a few days before his death, expressing deep frustration. The note read, "You're the only person who can make me feel whole, but you're also the one breaking me." It was a stark indication of how toxic their relationship had become. It also made the police wonder, was Emanuela capable of violence? Had she lashed out in a moment of despair? However, there was one crucial piece of evidence that began to unravel the mystery. Surveillance footage from the university library showed Emanuela entering Baldwin's office just a few hours before his death. But what the footage didn't show was whether she had left the office afterward. The authorities were left with a chilling question. If Emanuela had entered Baldwin's office that evening, had she also left, or had something more sinister occurred inside? Emanuela was becoming more and more overwhelmed by the ongoing investigation. Her classmates and friends had begun to distance themselves from her. The whispers about the professor and student affair had become impossible to ignore. In the days following Baldwin's death, Emanuela felt like she was drowning in a sea of suspicion, guilt, and confusion. Then, during one of the interrogations, something inside her broke. The detectives, sensing her vulnerability, began to press harder, trying to get her to confess. They knew how fragile Emanuela was and tried to exploit her emotions to break her down further. For hours, they asked her the same questions over and over, each time offering a new angle, a new piece of evidence, to make her doubt her own memory. It was during one of these sessions that Emanuela finally cracked. She broke down in tears, her voice shaking as she finally admitted to what had happened. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. "I just wanted him to stop. I wanted to make it stop." The detectives, sensing they were getting closer to the truth, pressed her further. Emanuela's confession was as heartbreaking as it was tragic. She revealed that the relationship with Baldwin had escalated to a point where she no longer recognized herself. He had been emotionally abusive, playing on her deepest insecurities, convincing her that she would never be loved by anyone else. Baldwin had promised her that everything would work out, that their love would eventually come to light. But deep down, Emanuela knew it was a lie. On the night of the murder, Baldwin had become angry, shouting at her when she questioned his commitment. She had pleaded with him to be honest with her, to end the affair, and to let her go. But Baldwin, in his usual manipulative fashion, turned the tables, telling her that she would never survive without him, that she would ruin her life if she left. He called her weak, desperate, and pathetic. It was in that moment, in a flash of intense emotion, that something inside Emanuela snapped. In her own words, "I just wanted him to stop. I didn't know what I was doing. I just wanted the pain to end." Emanuela described how Baldwin had grabbed her arm in anger, forcing her against the desk in his office. It was a physical confrontation, and in the heat of the moment, Emanuela acted out of sheer panic and fear. She had grabbed a paperweight from Baldwin's desk and, in an instant, struck him across the head. The blow had been hard and unexpected, and Baldwin crumpled to the floor. In that moment, Emanuela froze. She hadn't intended to kill him. She just wanted to get away from him. But Baldwin didn't move. He lay on the floor, blood pooling around him. She didn't know what to do. Emanuela, terrified of what she had just done, fled the scene without looking back. The aftermath was a blur. She had gone back to her dorm room, locked herself in, and spent hours thinking about the events that had just unfolded. Her mind was clouded with confusion, guilt, and fear. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The man she had been so dependent on for emotional support was now dead, and it was her fault. As news of Emanuela's confession broke, the town of Glenwood was plunged into an even deeper state of shock and disbelief. The quiet community had been rocked by the murder, and now, with Emanuela's confession, it seemed that everything they thought they knew about the case had changed. The trial that followed was one of the most highly publicized events in the town's history. News outlets from across the state flocked to Glenwood, eager to cover the sensational story of the professor's death and the student who had killed him. Emanuela was portrayed as a tragic figure, caught in a toxic, manipulative relationship with a man who had preyed upon her vulnerabilities. The defense argued that Emanuela had been a victim, emotionally broken by Baldwin's manipulation and control. They presented evidence of Baldwin's emotional abuse, showing how he had intentionally isolated her from friends and family. They painted Baldwin as a predator, exploiting his position of power to manipulate and dominate Emanuela. The prosecution, however, focused on the brutal nature of Baldwin's death. They painted Emanuela as someone who, in a moment of rage, had killed her former lover. The prosecution argued that while Baldwin's behavior had been despicable, Emanuela's actions were still those of a murderer. The case divided the town. Some viewed Emanuela as a victim of a toxic relationship, while others saw her as a murderer who needed to be held accountable for her actions. It was a heartbreaking story of emotional abuse and tragic consequences. After weeks of tense courtroom drama, the jury finally deliberated. Emanuela's fate was sealed. In the end, the jury found her guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The emotional toll of Baldwin's manipulation, combined with the circumstances surrounding his death, had led the jury to conclude that Emanuela had not premeditated the murder, but had acted in the heat of the moment. Emanuela was sentenced to a reduced prison term, one that allowed her the chance to rebuild her life after serving her time. It was a bittersweet conclusion to a tragic story. While some believed that justice had been served, others felt that the true villain, Baldwin, had gotten away scot-free. As for Emanuela, she was left to navigate the aftermath of her actions. She had lost everything: her family, her professor, her sense of self. But in time, she would learn to heal, to understand her own worth, and to rebuild the shattered pieces of her life. And as for the town of Glenwood, it would never be the same again. The story of Professor Baldwin's death and Emanuela Evans would be remembered for generations to come, not just as a tragic tale of love and betrayal, but as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most peaceful facades. The end.